Where did everything on planet Earth come from? How did life start? How did humankind begin their journey on planet Earth? Hi, I'm Dr. Stan Hudson. I want to welcome you to this 6-part series on the subject of origins. And we're going to be addressing those big questions of where everything came from. Those are the kind of questions that I was introduced to when I was a geology major back at UC Riverside way back in the day. I was introduced to the great world of rocks and fossils and the theory of evolution as to how we got all those things. I wasn't completely happy with all the answers that I was hearing, and I was led into a new area of religious faith. Today we're going to give you some evidence on the subject of where we even have a debate on where everything came from. Why is there such divergent views if the science should support a single view? Partway through this presentation there will be another video in which I'll be joining you, and also other people that are scientists and religious leaders who will be addressing the topic of the day. That will be our format as we go through our series. Right now we're going to turn things over to our local hosts, and again we want to thank you very deeply for joining us on this journey as we take a look at the great questions of where everything came from.
The two major theories, the two major ideas that have come up before the world. And that is one which is promoted by conventional science and one which is promoted by biblical religion. You may have seen these symbols here. The one that says Jesus in it, it's called an ichthys. Ichthys is a Greek acronym for Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And this was a symbol that was used by early Christians as a secret way of communicating to one another. Hey, are you a Christian? You show them the ichthys, and they see, okay, you are a Christian. Well, years ago, this was picked up on by Darwinists, and they used, by evolutionists, and they took that symbol and they put legs on it, and they put the name Darwin in it to say, this is our response. This is our response to the Christian view of beginnings. You may be interested to know what is the view of the world or in this country on our origins. How did life begin? How did the human race begin? And when we see the picture comes up, there's actually 3 different views that were presented as options. One of them is called theistic evolution. And the view there is that we came about through evolution, but God used evolution to bring us to where we are now. Another view is natural evolution, that there's no divinity, there is no God that brought this about. We came here randomly by a freak of nature. And the other view is that of that's more in line with what the Bible teaches, and that is God carried out a recent creation. You'll be interested to note that about 38% of the people polled by Gallup poll in 2017 felt that theistic evolution was the way that we got here. We got here by evolution, but God used that method to get us here. And about 38% in 2017 felt that it was a recent creation, according to what the Bible teaches. And about 19% believe that there is no divine hand involved, that we got here through natural processes only. That was in 2017. It's interesting that those numbers have changed slightly in 2024. When you look at the Gallup poll has been issued on a regular basis for the 21st century, and throughout the 21st century, more and more people are embracing Darwinism. More and more people are embracing natural evolution. Theistic evolution has remained about the same, between 34 and 38%. and fewer people are embracing a recent creation, as taught by the Bible. So, thank you so much. So, really appreciate it. So these are the numbers from 2017. 38% felt that humans evolved and God guided it. That's theistic evolution. Humans evolved and God had no part. 19%. God created humans in the present form in a recent creation. But in 2024, you can see the numbers shifted a little bit in regard to recent creation and evolution. More and more people are embracing evolution. This area is a passion, a personal passion for me. I was brought up in public schools. After I graduated from college, I said, I'm going to read the Bible, just see what it has to say. It's the most influential book in Western civilization. Jesus Christ, the most influential figure. I like history. I want to see what's there. I'm interested in reading that. And so I said, I'm going to read from cover to cover. I was very naive in regard to that. Like any other book, like a novel or something, I'm going to read from cover to cover. And I come to Genesis chapter 1, and Genesis chapter 1 goes through a 6-day creation period. And as I'm reading this, I'm saying, do people really believe this? Do people really believe this? Being brought up in public schools, I was taught that hundreds of millions of years of life have evolved to the present time. And I was taught as fact. And so when I read Genesis 1, I'm saying, do people really believe this? But after reading the Bible, I wanted to come to a better understanding why people believe that. And this began a journey of mine for the past 40 plus years of trying to understand and know what does the evidence teach. So to begin with, what is science? What is science? Well, the word science comes from the Latin word scientia. Hang on a second, we're going backward here now. I apologize for this. We may have to get a new hard screen here, flat screen. Wow. Well, it comes from the Latin word scientia, which means knowledge. And notice two things. First of all, it's a system of acquiring knowledge based on scientific method. And it's also considered as well the organized body of knowledge gained through such research. What does that mean? Scientific method is seeking to experiment, to demonstrate, or to draw conclusions or facts or evidence from. So I stand on the top of the Empire State Building. I have a ball made of brass and I have a ball made of rubber. I'm going to drop the two of them, see how long it takes for them to land, and see if one of them lands before the other. And I'm going to do that several times. That is the scientific method of experimenting. And I record the results. And I have those results with me and to share with others. That is what they call the organized body of knowledge gained through such research. Okay? This is what we talk about when we talk about science. Now, there is what's called hard science. Hard science is dropping those two balls, the brass one and the rubber one, from the top of the Empire State Building. That's hard science. Hard science is something that can be observed and predicted, and something that you can demonstrate, something that you can repeat. That's the science that's done in the lab. And then there's also what's called historical science. Historical science is looking at what we see today, knowing something took place in the past, and drawing some conclusions from it, developing a story about it. That's what historical science is. Historical knowledge is always subject to favored models and worldviews. We're going to be talking about a worldview. Let me give you an example. Let's say there was a woman found, we'll call her Mary. Mary was found dead in a hotel room. She had a gun in her hand and she had a bullet in her heart. Detective A comes along and looks at the evidence. He looks at the gun. It's only her fingerprints. It's only her DNA. Detective A knew Mary ahead of time and knew that she was not a very stable person. He considered her a little off. And so Detective A comes to the conclusion that Mary committed suicide. Well, Detective B comes along, and he looks at the same evidence. He sees the gun, but he also sees that there are some bruises on Mary. He sees that there's evidence of scuffling going on in the room as well. Both Detective A and Detective B saw that, but Detective B knew Mary ahead of time previously as well, and he knew that Mary hung out with some pretty dangerous folks. So Detective B comes to the conclusion that Mary was murdered and set up to look like a suicide. Both detectives are looking at the same evidence, but they come to a different conclusion based on their foreknowledge of Mary, based on their preconceptions or their perceptions of Mary. So this is important to know when it comes about historical science. Someone might ask, hey, if the facts are facts, then why don't we all believe the same thing? We both are looking at the same evidence, we're both seeing the same things, but we come to different conclusions. And that's where it's important to note that the data that we look at is not the same as interpretation. We can look at the same phenomena, but we can come to a different conclusion based on our perceptions. This is what is called a worldview. A worldview is the goggles that you have, whether you're conscious of it or not. The worldview is how you perceive reality. It's how you perceive reality. Everybody has a worldview. It's very much developed by your background. It's developed by your experiences. It's developed by the things that you have come to discover. So there are 5 questions that we answer in order to determine what our worldview is. First of all, what is your supreme authority? When I was a little boy, my daddy was my supreme authority. If there's something I didn't understand, I would go and ask him, and Daddy, why did this happen? Daddy, why did that happen? And what he told me, that was fact. That was my worldview. That's how I viewed reality at that point. As you get older, Daddy and Mommy are no longer the source of authority in your life. You find some other source of authority. Some look at God as their source of authority. Some look at philosophy or science as a source of authority. Number 2, where did everything come from? And this is what we're here to look at tonight, and hopefully for these next 5 sessions as well. Where did everything come from? The way you answer that very much reveals your worldview, how you perceive reality. And what is your place in this world? What is your place in this world? Are you significant? There are those who say that you are a random chance of nature, therefore you are basically a mistake. There are others who will tell you that you have a purpose in life, that you have a meaning in life, that someone created you. This is very important and very much plays a role in your own personal philosophy. What is your moral code? Your source of authority will very much determine what your moral code is, and this is important to know. And then finally, what is your future? What lies ahead? So these are the questions which basically will demonstrate what your worldview is. To look at an example of that, I want to talk about a minister who first studied and promoted fossils at this John Day Fossil Beds National Museum in Oregon. It had a plethora of mammalian fossils. He went there, dug them out, did some inspection, and he was the Oregon's first state paleontologist. This man's name was Thomas Condon, and this is the conclusion he came to. He said the hills from which these evidences were taken, he said, were made by the same God who made the hills of Judea, and the evidences are as authoritative. So this man was a Christian. He was a minister. He goes to these hills. He goes to these mountains. He digs up these fossils. and he says that God is speaking to us as much from these rocks as he did from Judea and from Jerusalem. And notice what he says. The church has nothing to fear from the uncovering of the truth. Evolution was simply God's method of working, and therefore is not atheistic or infidel. You get an idea of what Thomas Cobden's worldview is. He is a minister. He was a minister, but he also was a scientist or a researcher. From his perspective, theistic evolution was the right way. Theistic evolution was the truth and how we got here. So he understood that the biblical account of creation was not to be taken literally, but in a day-age type principle. So your worldview is going to determine how you view suffering in the world today, how you view benevolence in the world today, how you view catastrophes in the world today. Your worldview will determine how you look at the Bible, how you look at religion, and how you look at science as well. Your worldview is going to determine how you look at the world. So can I ask you one more time to give that a shot? And I apologize. I thought we were all set with this, and I determined later, found out later that no, you may be having problems with this. I was told it's not the cable, but that it is the connection there. I have a cable as well, but we'll see. So your worldview will tell us whether or not you believe the chicken came first or the egg came first. Your worldview will tell you as well where you believe this world is going, if it's going to end, and how it's going to end. So these are critical questions that we all are going to have. And your worldview is going to determine your view of God. Does he exist? Does he not exist? If he does exist, is he the type of God who likes to punish, or is he a beneficent, loving God? Now, one of the questions I want to ask is, can a believer in God be a scientist? Now, you'll be surprised at some of the answers that you'll get on this. You might say, well, of course. Well, let's take a look at that. 1998 poll of members of the National Academy of Sciences. This is the group of people who basically do the textbooks in our grade school, public schools, and our universities and the like. All right, a group of them, thought and policy leaders in science education. How many of these people that were polled believe in a personal God? How many we got there? 7%. How many disbelieve? 72. And how many are agnostic or saying, I don't know and I really don't care? 21%. So this tells us that a full 93% of those in the National Academy of Sciences are not believers in God. And this is going to be reflected in our textbooks and the like. This is going to be reflected in that. I remember, anybody here knows, what's his name? He's an astronomer.
Carl Sagan.
Not Carl Sagan, he passed away. Neil deGrasse Tyson. Neil deGrasse Tyson, I remember listening to him one time on a TED Talk, and he goes, we shouldn't be so concerned about the number of people, the number of scientists who don't believe in God. We've got to address those who do believe in God. That's what he said. We've got to address those who do believe in God. But can a believer in God be a good scientist? Do you know that the scientific revolution was started by all Christians?
Yes, sir.
All Christians. Sir Isaac Newton, notice he said, no sciences are better attested than the religion of the Bible. Newton, Kepler, Copernicus, all these, Louis Pasteur, all these great men and women of science who began the revolution, they had the worldview that we are made in the image of God, and God is a rational God. Therefore, carrying out science we are thinking God's thoughts after him. That was the mindset of these early Christians. And that was the case with many universities. Since the 1200s, universities in Europe, Cambridge here, for example, only taught that God had created the world like the Bible said. And for centuries, all graduates tended to think the same as their professors. So when these great universities were established in Europe and in America, they all taught that it was God who created. But something happened. Universities in the West only teach now materialism. That is, nature created all that we see here today. And now most of all graduates, they go with what the professors say as well. So as we see the numbers declining, for those who believe that there was a recent creation, one of the big reasons for that is because that's what is taught in our public schools. That's what's taught in our academic communities as well. I want to share with you a couple of quotes. Here we have Richard Lewontin. He's a Harvard biologist. And notice what he says. We have a prior commitment, a commitment to what? Materialism. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot what? Allow a divine foot in the door. Materialism is the belief that the only thing that exists is material. That there is no divinity. And that we came about through processes in nature alone. That's materialism. And notice what he is saying here is dogma for much of conventional science. We cannot consider a God. I heard someone call it ABC science. Anything but a creator science. ABC science. And he's not alone in this. Many of you may have heard of Richard Dawkins from Oxford University. Standout new atheist. He is the most probably most prolific and most verbal of all atheists today. He loves to debate. If you ever want to talk to the guy and you listen to his debates, boy, this man's got a great mind. He has got a great mind. Biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been what? Listen to this. Richard Dawkins is saying, when I look at nature, when I look at biology, I see things that on the surface, it appears that it's been designed. And it appears it's been designed for a purpose. But I can't allow a divine foot in the door. It has not been designed. There is no purpose behind it. Richard Dawkins says that we live in a blind, pitiless universe, basically. Blind, pitiless universe. Francis Crick, he was one of the famous Nobel Peace Prize winners who elucidated the DNA structure. You may have heard of Crick and Watson. Notice what he had to say. Biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather what? Rather evolved. Why do they have to keep that in mind? Because when you look at it, it appears that it's been designed for a purpose. But you got to keep in mind that it evolved, that it was not designed, that it was not designed. Thomas Kuhn wrote this book, The Structure of Science and Revolutions. He took years and studied the mind of Aristotle. He wanted to understand what Aristotle was thinking. And when he was done with his research, he had a very good understanding at that point, but he's wondering, okay, why don't we think like this man anymore? Why don't we have some of the same conclusions that this man had? And he began thinking about how is it that mindsets and cultures change. And he used the word paradigm. How is it that paradigms change? And what he determined is that a paradigm takes hold of a particular community, and once it takes hold, it is very, very difficult to change. It doesn't change in a moment. It doesn't change in a year. There's going to be great resistance toward that. Now, some scientists took objection to what he said because science is supposed to be objective. Science is supposed to be let the evidence lead to where it goes, wherever it goes. But the truth is, and many will tell you this, that is not the case with any community. Religious community, scientific community, any community, there are paradigms that people operate under. Now, you and I look at this rock surface, and we would probably all conclude that this came about by different forces of nature. Wind, rain, erosion, this all happened to happen. But we move over a little bit, and we see some other figures here, and nobody in their right mind would say that this came about by accident, that this came about by nature, by wind, by rain, and by erosion. But this is what we see in nature today. When we look at things, they have the appearance of design for a purpose. The biggest and most fundamental science question of all will always reveal a world view. And what is that question? How did life appear? The way you answer that question determines or demonstrates what your worldview is. First of all, we have to ask the question, what is life? And you're going to get a whole bunch of different answers. You're going to get a different answer from a different group of people. But there's one, Encyclopedia Britannica, Merriam-Webster tells us that life is a principle of force that is considered to underlie the distinctive quality of animate beings, characterized by a capacity for metabolism, growth, reaction to stimuli, and reproduction. Everybody got that one? That's a rough one. But it's saying, okay, if I poke a rock with a pin, it will not react, therefore the rock is not alive. If I take a plant and poke at it, you may see some type of reaction to it. I see a Venus flytrap. Sometimes when I see it, I like to stick my finger in there just for a little while, and I like to see it react and try to close in on my finger. That Venus flytrap is alive, according to this definition. However, there is no consensus today regarding the definition of life. You ask different sources, and you'll get different answers. Depending on what your motive is, you may broaden your definition of life if you are trying to define or trying to defend your worldview. Am I making sense? And I'll show that in just a little bit. So here is a question that is brought up. One of the most obvious big questions is, how did life arise from inorganic matter? The magazine American Scientist points out that this remains a great unknown. If indeed we came here through materialistic processes, if indeed we got here only through natural occurrences, how then did we get from an atom or a series of atoms to living beings? How did that take place? And that is something that just can't be answered. Some resort to what's called panspermia. People say that it was through intelligent beings that came here to this planet and placed life here. Some say that when you look at the fossil record, you see an explosion of creatures at the bottom of one particular strata. So aliens came and planted those creatures here, came back hundreds of millions of years later and planted another set of creatures, came back later, planted another set of creatures. Some actually say that. Others say, no, we got hit with a meteor that had living tissue in it, and that began to evolve here on this planet. That's the idea of panspermia. However, I want to point out something that's one of the greatest scientists known, Louis Pasteur, pointed out. He said that there is no circumstance in which it can be confirmed that microscopic beings came into the world without germs, without parents similar to themselves. And in other words, Louis Pasteur said, the more you study it, the more it's evident that life only can beget life. Okay? Everybody has a parent. Everybody was taken from, was brought up, begot by someone else. This disproved the popular theory of spontaneous generation. So before Louis Pasteur, there was the idea that life spontaneously came about. He did some experiments which showed that no, that is not taking place. If you see maggots in a dead body, all right, they got there. They did not spontaneously generate. And he pointed that out. That led to the framing of the biological law of biogenesis. Life only begets life. However, there is a great effort by many scientists to determine or to prove what's called abiogenesis. That is life from non-life. Nearly all scientists today believe, remember that 1998 poll among National Academy of Sciences, nearly all scientists believe in abiogenesis. That is, life came about via a natural chemical process from a hot chemical vent or pool, and they would disagree with Pasteur's law. And there is a lot of money being spent on trying to demonstrate abiogenesis, that life is coming from non-life. If abiogenesis happened, it was because of chemistry, not biology. Why is that? Because you have to start with the simple cells. You have to start with the cells. You have to start with the simple chemicals in order to make protein, in order to make living tissue. It had to start there in some way. 1952, you had the Miller-Urey experiment. And what they did is a very interesting, very ingenious experiment that they put together. They had a gaseous mixture of what they believed the early pre-life Earth was made of. And then they had water, and then they had electricity as well. And they sent the electricity through it, and they were able to create what's called amino acids. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. Proteins are the building blocks of life. But today, scientists largely disregard this because, number one, the gaseous makeup that they had, it does not, what they believe, reflect what the early Earth was like in the evolutionary mindset. And furthermore, amino acids that were generated, you have, I'll get a little technical here, you have right-hand and left-hand ones, and the body only has one of those. You had to eliminate half of the amino acids somehow in order for them to build life. I want to share this quote from you. How did the basic chemicals present on early Earth spontaneously arrange themselves into something resembling life? How did we get DNA? Oh, this is really important. How did the first cells look like, or what did the first cells look like? More than half a century after the chemist Stanley Miller proposed his primordial soup, that is, the blend of chemicals that was on the early Earth before life came about, proposed his primordial soup theory, we still can't agree about what happened. This was back in 2013, and that's still the case today. In fact, the more we learn about life, the more we learn about the cell, the more we learn about these things, the more the goalposts are being moved back. The more difficult it would be to carry out abiogenesis. Life is becoming more and more complex. In Darwin's day, the belief was that cells were basically made up of jelly goo called protoplasm. We're a bunch of protoplasm. But today we see that is not the case. In 1665, Robert Hooke first saw and identified the human cell. They reminded him of rooms at a monastery, and that's why he called them cells. But all he was able to see was the outside of them. He was able to see the boundary of them. And so by Darwin's time, and we're going to talk about Darwin shortly, it was thought that they contained mostly protoplasm, a jelly-like structure. However, today, that is entirely changed. Today, that is entirely changed. Notice what Michael Behe, in his book, Darwin's Black Box, says, now it's the turn of the fundamental science of life, modern biochemistry, to disturb. That is, when you learn about modern biochemistry, this is going to be very much disturb the idea of evolution. The simplicity that was once expected to be the foundation of life has proven to be a phantom. Instead, what? Systems of horrendous irreducible complexity inhabit the cell. Irreducible complexity, what do we mean by that? That means if you take out any one part of the system will fail to work. It will not work anymore. Like if you had a mouse trap and you took away the hammer, you're not going to catch a mouse. If you took away the cheese, you would not catch the mouse. Okay? Every part of that mouse trap is required in order for it to function. And so too, when we look at the human cell, we see every part is required in order for that cell to work. It could not be built up gradually by doing the parts by themselves and then bringing them together. In fact, there are 40 trillion cells in your body with 200 different types of functions. You've got eye cells, you've got thumbnail cells, you've got skin cells, you've got particular cells for the heart, particular cells for the lungs. You have many different types of cells in your bodies. How did they all come about is the question. All right, do we have any engineers here? Any mechanics here? Okay, I see a couple. Tell me, what does this look like to you? What does it look like?
A lot of gears.
It looks like a lot of gears. Well, this is a graphic way of portraying what is called a flagellum in bacterial cell. The flagellum is like a motor that allows the bacteria to move. And this is what it looks like. This is what it looks like. Looks very close to what a mechanic would put together as well. How did that happen? How was that carried out? Remember, biology, as we're told, has the appearance of design for a purpose. And I'm quoting an atheist by saying that. And that becomes more and more true when we look at it. It becomes more and more true. One of the biggest potholes in science is believing that things are simple and basing conclusions off of that. If things were simple, if cells were simply protoplasm, then yeah, maybe evolution can take place. But the more complexity we see, the more questions come up, and the more issues we're going to be dealing with. So how did the theory of evolution arise? Let's take a look at that. First of all, when we're talking about evolution, I want to make very clear what we're talking about. There is what's called microevolution. That is, you have a particular family of creatures, and you see variations within that family. All right. So, for example, these are called Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands. They're all finches, and you'll see that they all have different beak sizes. Okay. And what was determined is that when one finch or a series of finches migrates from one island to another, then several generations later, the beaks have changed based on the environment. And that happens, this microevolution is a fact. It is observed, it can be experimented on, it can be demonstrated. Microevolution is a fact. Variations within a species or within a family. But there's the idea of macroevolution. And that is that one family of creatures will eventually, over time, with a series of changes, become another. There's the idea that these land-dwelling creatures, the Pakicetus, was found in the fossil records, eventually evolved into whales. They migrated out to the sea and became whales. That is macroevolution. So in this series, when we're talking about evolution, we're talking about macroevolution. Micro is proven, micro is demonstrable, micro is something we observe and we can see. But macro is the big question. So how did this develop? Well, in the 19th century, there was, in a sense, a perfect storm for this to come on board, for this to take place. First of all, the standing of the Bible was becoming weaker in our Western society. There are more and more skeptics in regard to the Bible. You had many people who began studying it with higher criticism. I think higher criticism could be very helpful, but they began looking at it not as something inspired, not as something that was handed down to us, but another interesting form of ancient literature. So it began losing its place as authoritative within society. Also, there are some key fossils that were discovered in the 19th century that began leading people to question things. For example, there is the Archaeopteryx, which seems to be, or which is purported to be, a transition between lizard and bird. It had features like a bird and had features like a lizard as well. There were dinosaur bones that were found as well, creatures that we don't see today, that we haven't seen before. And then there was, and we're going to talk more about this on Thursday night, the Neanderthal. In the cave in Germany, there was hominid-type bones that were found that looked to be, quote, more primitive than man, than modern man. And so this began leading people to question things. Also, there was the ignorance about the complexity of genetics. As I mentioned, people thought that cells were basically protoplasm. There was no concept, no idea of what genes are and how the cell works. And probably one of the biggest contributions was Charles Lyell in the 18th century, who came up with the idea of what's called uniformitarianism. And he said that the strata that we see in the rock layers, those were developed over millions of years. Not because of Noah's flood, but because of centimeter upon centimeter of sedimental layer. And so, as people found fossils in these millions of years of strata, the idea became more and more predominant that life has been around for hundreds of millions of years. And that undercuts what the Bible teaches about life. People began losing confidence in the Bible as a result of these things. Uniformitarianism, hundreds of millions of years of life, became predominant in much of the culture's worldview. And then came Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin actually was going to school to be a minister. Did you know that? I think it was Cambridge University, I think he went to. He was going to school to be a minister. After he graduated, he took, and his parents were very rich, and so he was able to go on a 5-year vacation on the HMS Beagle. And he went to different places in the world, especially the Galapagos Islands, and he wanted to do some research there. And one of the things that stood out to him is that as the natives of the island came to him, they were able to tell him which turtle came from which island. And he asked him, well, how can you tell that? Oh, the shape of their shells tells us which island they came from. So he said, okay, so these turtles had different shape of shells based on the island that they lived in. And he saw the same thing with the finches as well that I mentioned earlier. And so Charles Darwin came to the conclusion that evolution was taking place among these creatures based on a term that he used, natural selection. Let me talk about that. Darwin coined the phrase survival of the fittest. Now, I want to point out that Darwin did not start the idea of evolution. Evolution was around for centuries before then. In fact, the view of evolution that was most strongest before Darwin published his work was called Lamarckian evolution. And that was a view that, for example, the giraffe, he had to keep stretching his neck to get the taller plants. And as a result, over the years, his neck grew. That's Lamarckian evolution. Well, Charles Darwin rejected that and he came up with another process. The natural process by which organisms best adjust to their environment are most successful in surviving and reproducing. That is natural selection. Now, Charles Darwin saw in his hometown what was called artificial selection. Farmers would breed the best cattle in order to maintain the best cattle on their farm. If you had a sickly one, if you had one that wasn't doing very well, you wouldn't breed that one. That's artificial selection. Charles Darwin proposed that nature was doing the same thing. That if you had a finch with a long beak and it needed that beak to get down into that ant hole and get those ants, and changes in the environment, changes in nature took place so that only that finch would live and all the others that didn't have that type of beak would die, then only that finch would pass on to have offspring. That's natural selection, survival of the fittest. Now again, Darwin had no idea about genetics. And so when we began learning more about genes, then a change or modification or an enhancement was made to Darwinianism, which is called net evolution. Before I jump to that, let me point out that Darwin took it a step further and said, these changes take place among the turtles, these changes take place among the finches. Given enough time, given enough changes, finches will become another type of creature. Turtles will become another type of creature by adapting to their environment. That is the macroevolution, a larger scale permanent change that results in the formation of a higher taxonomic groups. That's a fancy way of saying that one family of animals becomes another. All right? These amphibians eventually become reptiles. These reptiles become mammals, etc. And he produced his book, The Origin of Species by the Means of what? Natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. This book, according to some scholars, is probably the third most influential book in Western civilization. First is the Bible, the second, well, not Western, the whole world. The first is the Bible, the second is the Quran, the third is The Origin of Species. This changed the world almost unlike any other book did. Unlike any other book. So, what Darwin contributed was a theory that explained how evolution worked. Again, he didn't invent the idea of evolution, but he had this idea, this theory of how evolution worked, and that is natural selection. But there's a question, there's a point. We learn more about genes after Darwin. We learn about genes after Darwin. Survival of the fittest doesn't change the genetic code of living creatures. All it does is make a species fit. So what more scientists began doing is we got to modify Darwinism since we know about genes and throw in the idea of mutations. And that's called neo-Darwinism. In other words, a mutation takes place that gives you a new feature. Now, most mutations are deleterious. They're harmful or don't have any impact at all. But rarely, once in a while, you'll get a beneficial mutation. How many here are lactose intolerant? I see a couple of hands. Guess what? You are not the mutants. Those of us who are who can do lactose, who can eat that ice cream and drink that milk, we are the mutants. Because a mutation took place at some point which told a gene that to stop turning off lactose. Okay? So originally, it appears, studying the genome, the whole human race became lactose intolerant when the child was weaned off of the mother. So there is a gene that was turned on that said, stop taking mother's milk. Okay? But that gene became broken. A mutation occurred. So those who are lactose intolerant, that gene still works. You are not the mutants. I just want you to be encouraged tonight about that. So, a favorable mutation, they said, can make a species more fit in a particular environment. Let's go back to that finch that had that long beak. The idea was that some mutation took place which made that beak grow longer. And because of that, that finch became more suitable to the environment than all the other finches. And that's called neo-Darwinism. However, there's even more problems with this theory. I want to share with you a quote from Dennis Noble. He's an evolutionist himself, a physiologist. And he tells us the following. He says, all the central assumptions of the modern synthesis, that's what's called neo-Darwinism, have been what? Have been disproved. This is coming from an evolutionist. He's saying we need to find a method other than neo-Darwinism, other than mutation by natural selection or natural selection doing mutations to account for evolution, because all the bases have been disproved. Stephen Meyer, who is a standout in the intelligent design community, says the technical literature in biology is now replete, that is, there's a lot of it, with world-class biologists routinely expressing doubts about various aspects of neo-Darwinian theory. Rarely has there been such a great disparity between the popular perception of a theory and its actual standing in the relevant peer-reviewed science literature. What is he saying here? If you read textbooks, they'll tell you neo-Darwinianism is a fact. If you listen to the media, you'll hear that evolution is a fact. But when you talk to the actual researchers, when you talk to the actual world-class biologists, they'll tell you there's a lot of issues with this theory. There's a lot of issues with these ideas, and we do not have answers for that. I'd like you to watch this 11-minute video that discusses some of these things.
Bereshit bara Elohim hashamayim v'haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And pretty much for centuries, through the Middle Ages, that was the single thought that people had about where origins came from. But then toward the 1800s, the age of reason that it is called now by science, the thought that maybe there was not an active God out there, and maybe the laws of nature was all that was in operation. So this skepticism grew about the biblical account. Charles Darwin was taught in a university, Cambridge University, that had this skepticism, and pretty soon the worldview about where we came from dramatically changed. Today we still have this debate going between creationists and evolutionists. And let's now take a look at the origin of this great debate.
To understand this, we need to go back to where science came from. It was a revolutionary new way of understanding our world. And what it did was it said, we're not going to bring all of our preconceptions into this. We're not going to let philosophers like Aristotle or somebody else tell us how the world works. What we're going to do is we're going to actually look at the world. We're going to use our empirical senses. That's our eyes, ears, sense of touch, those sorts of things. And those data that we collect using those senses, we will interpret in a logical way. And that was a very powerful tool then for figuring out what's going on in the world. But then some people added an additional rule called methodological naturalism. It said not just that we should logically interpret data and that data will drive our theories. It said those theories may not ever come to the conclusion that God was involved in any way. It can only be naturalistic explanations that we can come up with.
The idea of natural selection actually was kind of around in those days when Darwin was developing his theory. Other people, in fact, had proposed essentially the same thing, but nobody had developed it in detail and with lined up arguments and evidence and made a case for it. So Darwin collected these ideas, and he credits reading Malthus on population over population and the competition for resources, and he was thinking about nature as a kind of a competition between different organisms, and then he realized there's more organisms than there are resources, so naturally those who are stronger will get the resources and survive. And he played off that actually an inevitable conclusion. It's self-evident that if you have limited resources, the stronger are going to succeed better than the weaker. But Darwin's real strength, I think, was in developing a series of arguments that rested on evidence that, in fact, this kind of thing does happen in nature.
Well, I would say Darwin is certainly an icon in science. He's respected, and his contribution is perceived as really world-changing in some respects. So he is one of the holy saints of science, at the same level as Newton or other very important figure, Galileo Galilei. Now, when it comes to the mechanisms that Darwin suggested in terms of what could bring change in species or what could originate new species, when you begin to look at the granular level of the theory that he proposed, that might not be as popular nowadays. Why? Because we have so much more understanding of the complexity of life and understanding of basic things like the DNA, for example, that was not common knowledge at the time of Darwin. So he could envisage a much simpler way, in a sense, or a broad sketch of what he thought could happen, but he didn't have a clue of what was actually happening inside cells.
Today, Darwin's views are somewhat under scrutiny, but it would be helpful, I think, to kind of dissect apart his views. One of his views was naturalism, and that view is under challenge. There is evidence, maybe there's gaps in nature, that there must be some kind of power involved. And of course, the intelligent design movement has used that and developed that argument that, in fact, there is something more than just nature. Another view of Darwin is that natural selection can account for varieties that adapt to local habitats. And I think virtually everybody accepts that. Then Darwin's view that microevolution, if you want to call it that, this natural selection of small changes, that accumulates over time to eventually produce macroevolution. Well, scientists have held to that very strongly because they were afraid to give creationists any kind of a foothold. But as time has gone on, the scientific community has kind of gotten wary of that argument, saying, no, we don't see this is going to work. For example, if it's advantageous to have a longer tail, well, you can get that tail longer and longer and longer, but you're never going to make a wing out of it. How do you get a new organ? Microevolution just is not going to add up to a new organ. Plus, looking at the fossil record, you do not see that in any way. Looking at modern experiments, you do not see that in any way. It just doesn't work. So at the present time, the scientific community, the evolutionary biology community, is looking for ways to explain macroevolution. So far, they haven't found one, but there's many, many, many of them that recognize that Darwin's theory doesn't cut it. Another aspect of Darwin's theory is common ancestry. And I think for the most part, common ancestry is still accepted without empirical evidence, I would say, but as a necessary conclusion from materialism. If you're going to have only natural processes, you're not going to have different kinds of animals popping into existence all over the place. You're lucky to have it once. And so if you have once, then maybe you can play with it from then on. But common ancestry is one I think is weakly supported, but it's necessary for naturalism.
The people who are molecular biologists and who are experts in the field of how genes act and how they function and whether or not genes get duplicated and what bacteria do with extra DNA if they encounter it, those guys are often working on particular problems. They're trying to solve cancer. They're trying to come up with a way of dealing with COVID. They're trying to solve a particular problem. And then you have another group of people over here who are trying to show that evolution is true. And they'll hypothesize about things that happen with DNA, these massive gene duplications that then resulted in new functions. but they never actually check their hypotheses with the people who actually know what they're talking about in terms of molecular biology. So there's often not a whole lot of crossover in between those fields, the theoretical evolutionary biologists and then the ones who actually are where the rubber meets the road. So I think sometimes hypotheses get generated about how these processes could have taken place. They're not necessarily in line with what even evolutionary molecular biologists would have to say. So there's sometimes a disconnect there. So that's the main way. They just ignore it often. The people who are working in problem-solving areas, evolution obviously took place. Have you thought about it? No, I'm busy trying to solve cancer. These guys down here, evolution obviously took place. Well, have you thought about it? Yes, I'm thinking about it very carefully. I think that this happened and this happened. Well, but that can't happen. Well, don't dissuade me with the facts, ma'am. So sometimes there's a lot of what are called in the literature just so stories, that this must have happened this way. Do we have any proof? Maybe, but there's no it happened in the laboratory.
Worldview are kind of like glasses. That's one of my favorite illustrations. But the glasses, everyone has a pair. Some people aren't as aware of their worldview as others, but basically it's the lenses through which we interpret life. Worldviews are really helpful in what we would use them to answer the big questions. Does God exist? Does he or doesn't he? However you answer that question determines a whole lot of direction of where you're going to go. Where did the world come from? What does it mean to be human? Is there life after death? Ethics. Why are some things right or wrong? And then maybe another question might be, is there a grand overarching story that gives meaning to existence or not?
So what we think on the subject of origins is entirely shaped by our worldview. And does your worldview include a picture of a large and powerful and caring and capable God? Is he able to give us a record of what's taken place at the beginning? Does he care enough to think we actually would like to have that record? All of these things affect how we view the data, how we interpret the data through the filter of our worldview. Let's begin to take a look a little bit more now about some of the positive images that Scripture holds about the God who created us.
I'm going to cut this portion short because I want to give an opportunity for a Q&A session. But however you view origins, it's a matter of faith. It's a matter of faith. The Bible tells us by faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. Nobody was there recording it. Nobody was there photographing it, videoing it, okay? We take that by faith. And by faith, another person would say that biology it came about, or living things came about by random processes, random natural processes. Nobody was there, nobody's observed that. And so that's a statement of faith as well. What I'd like to do at this point, I'd like to ask one of our greeters to come forward with our cards. And we are going to select 2 people. And while they're doing it, I just want to look at a couple of more quotes that I think you might like to be interested in. Alistair McGrath. He wrote about Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins wrote the book The God Delusion, and in response, Alistair McGrath wrote the book The Dawkins Delusion. And he says the following: although I was passionately and totally persuaded of the truth and relevance of atheism as a young man, I subsequently found myself persuaded that Christianity was a much more interesting and intellectually exciting worldview than atheism. And I agree with him Before I began reading the Bible, I was what you call a deist. I believe there had to be a God. I believe there had to be some superpower that created all things, that started all things. But I believed he was impersonal. But I changed my worldview. This is Werner von Braun. He was a head scientist of NASA. And he said that religion and science are sisters. The one seeks knowledge of creation and the other of the Creator. I love that. I love that. We don't need to have the conflict that we see in the world today between science and religion. I'm committing myself to you. Our team is committing ourselves to you. We want to look at these issues of origins over these 6 sessions. We want to research together. We want to explore together. We want to learn together. And I pray that you will be blessed and that you will learn things that will help, that will plug you, that will impress you, that will lead you to seek to understand more and more fully. That's my prayer and my hope for each of us. So let's start with some questions. Yes.
I know Stephen Hawking was, he was in evolution as well, right?
Who's that?
Stephen Hawking.
Stephen Hawking. Yes. He was the man who was very very much disabled. Yes. Yeah.
So he came to a conclusion that God does exist, or
Did he come to the conclusion? Did Stephen Hawking come to the conclusion that God exists?
were there any of these men that you had mentioned tonight? Any of them come to that conclusion at all? That there is an existence?
Well, you saw McGrath's testimony. McGrath, who wrote the Dawkins Delusion, he was an atheist at one time. But there are some who have come away from the atheistic view. One of the most recent was Ayaan Ali. She was born a Muslim, and she was abused within the Muslim community. And so she became an atheist. She forsook all religion, wanted nothing to do with it. She became an atheist, and she was mentored under Richard Dawkins. But she was struggling with depression, with other things in her life, and she, in desperation, called out to God. And today she's a Christian. And she takes her stand. She's had debates with Richard Dawkins. So wonderful woman, Ayaan Ali. I can't remember how to pronounce her last name, but if you look her up. But I don't know. Stephen Hawking, he questioned. He came up with the idea of a multiverse. And we're going to talk more about that in one of our sessions, a multiverse. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. If I can ask, I said, Kelly.
I just Googled it and it says Stephen Hawking was an atheist.
Yeah, he was an atheist. Yeah, he was an atheist. But the question was, did he come to the conclusion, come to the point where he accepted that there had to be a God? Yeah. But throughout his career, he was an atheist. Yeah. Anything else? All right, Renford, I ask you to come up in front. We're going to close this with a word of prayer, and we have some refreshments. Again, if you have a ticket, we have 10 of those Genesis and science books available. We're going to get more of them next week. So if you don't get one tonight, hold on to your ticket. We'll have some of them next week. So we have the literature booth over there. You can take anything there, and we have the refreshments here as well. Renford?
Pastor John, thank you so much for this presentation, and we're looking forward to the next 5. May we pray. Most holy, righteous God, we want to thank you for this knowledge that you've presented here for us tonight. I hope that every person that here tonight gained something walking out of here. We ask, oh Lord, that you may prepare our mind, our heart, our thoughts, so that we could come back and finish up these series. Because, Lord, we know that you are God, and we know that you create all things. So we are very much interested, dear Father, to see these series. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
If you would like more resources or more information regarding Origins, please scan the QR code shown. May God bless your day.